you wanna be my friend? And if you do, well then don't be afraid to take me by the hand. If you want to, I think this is how love goes. Check yes or no.
It is 9:27 right here on this 16th day of March. Tom Emery joins us again to fill us in and reflect on the Dred Scott decision, which, as we reflect upon, 1857. Now, Tom, was the decision March the 6th or 7th?
It was March 6th, 1857, handed down by the Supreme Court. Yes, sir.
That's what I was thinking. I was telling people earlier, Tom, I said, now, don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure I just looked this up and did some research, and it was March the 6th. But this was one of in my opinion, one of these biggest, most impactful court decisions, we've come to know.
Absolutely. It was a landmark moment for all the wrong reasons in American legal history. The Dred Scott case, many consider as a flashpoint in the slavery debate, and many historians believe that really pushed the country into an inevitable civil war. So it was a top moment in our American legal history, but again, for all the wrong reasons.
Right. And can you take us through some of those wrong reasons and give us a little bit of a refresher on just exactly the prowess that this case brought?
Yes, sir. Dred Scott was a black man, a slave from St. Louis. At the time, he was owned by Dr. John Emerson, who was a civilian doctor who became a U.S. Army surgeon. Emerson took Scott to his one assignment at Fort Armstrong in Rock Island, Illinois. This should have entitled Scott to his freedom based on the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which prohibited slavery in this entire territory, as well as the fact that slavery is barred under the Illinois Constitution. He was later taken to a further assignment at Fort Snelling, which is in current area of St. Paul, Minnesota. Again, that was governed by the Missouri Compromise, which prohibited slavery north of the famous 3630 line. Emerson later died. Dred Scott and his wife, who he'd met at Fort Snelling, sued for their freedom in St. Louis courts starting in 1846. The case wound the way through many courts. The Scotts had some verdicts for and against. It finally advanced to the U.S. Supreme Court, where, as you said, the date March 6, 1857, the court, in a 7-2 decision, said that blacks were not citizens and therefore had no right to sue. The case also effectively invalidated the famous Missouri Compromise, saying that Congress had no right to decide slavery in territories. The Dred Scott's case remains one of the significant moments of American history, certainly 1850, certainly the pre-Civil War era, and as I said, really helped push the America toward an inevitable Civil War, which was our 4 darkest years in our history.
Right. And to me, what I think is so fascinating about the Dred Scott decision, too, is something, we always like to tie in, is the Alton connection. And, we always hear about Lovejoy and all of these, influential individuals that Alton's, harbored also the bad side of things as well and the not so good parts of history. But what are some of the Alton connections, Tom, with this Dred Scott decision?
Well, the first mayor of Alton was John Crum, who was a mayor through the Lovejoy riot, as you just referenced. He was the first, as he moved to St. Louis, where he also served as mayor, but in between was a St. Louis circuit judge. He was the first judge on the many proceedings that wound the way through the courts and for Dred Scott. Scott, the first attorney for Dred and Harriet Scott, was a former prosecuting attorney from Alton, Francis Murdoch. And there's been some belief that maybe the Scotts, and I don't know this is proven, got in touch with Murdoch through a gentleman named John Anderson, who was minister of one of the black churches that Harriet Scott attended. Anderson had been Elijah Lovejoy's typesetter.
Wow!
So they're a handful, and it's not proven whether that's how they all connected, but certainly Crum and Murdoch played at least a minor role in the Dred Scott legal saga.
That's very fascinating. And so with this, just so I'm understanding a little bit more too, and maybe all of us at home watching, So was John Crumb, was he again, just so I can remember this correctly, and I'm sorry for my lack of knowledge on this, but when I don't know something, I call the ones that do. Was John Crumb, was he against, was he a prosecutor against Dred Scott in this case?
John Crumb was actually the judge that sat on
The
the
judge
case.
on it. That's what I
Yeah,
was he,
yeah,
so
and he leaned pro-slavery.
okay. And that's what I was kind of wanting to kind of get some more insights on. That's very fascinating. And so with this case, one of the most impactful, the effects of what the decision was pretty grand. Can you describe a little bit of what just exactly the effects were? We know what it led to ultimately, but just immediately, what are some of the effects that you saw in your research?
Well, first and foremost, the Supreme Court decision said that blacks were not citizens,
Right.
and had no right to sue, and that the white, and in so many words, it was worded like this: the white man had no need to respect them, their needs,
Right.
or their anything like that. It also invalidated the Missouri Compromise. The country had been torn by slavery almost from the outset. The Missouri Compromise in 1820 was another way, literally, for America to kick the can down the road, allowing Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and prohibiting slavery north of the 3630 parallel, which, with the exception of Missouri itself, that is equal to the southern border of Missouri. In saying the Dred Scott's case, they said the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. The Congress had no right to prohibit slavery in federal territories. So that was it was another moment in American history that wiped out an earlier significant moment in many ways. But obviously, the idea that saying blacks are not citizens
Right.
was something that, to this day, turns our stomachs. And at the time, while the South kind of rejoiced and supported it, many Northerners, whether they're abolitionists or not, did not like that idea.
Wow. Well, and too, Tom, I was doing a little bit of research just yesterday while I was kind of thinking about our conversation today, and I also saw that that James Buchanan, the former president, may have influenced Justice Robert Greer of Pennsylvania to join the Southerners in the majority, so that the decision would make it kind of a less regional thing. Is that the case?
Well, Buchanan had actually been sworn into office just 2 days before the
Wow.
Dred Scott case, because at that time, our inauguration is March 4th. It was in this country until 1933. Buchanan really had no issues with slavery. Many people consider Buchanan the worst president we ever had, which is interesting. He preceded Lincoln, the best president we ever had.
Right.
So Buchanan was from Pennsylvania, and that's been debated and speculated on. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. And Tom, with this, it seems to me that every time we look at the Dred Scott case in the decision, that we kind of that someone always gets a little bit more of details out of it. Every time we talk about a new meaning, a new message, a new reason of why it's so important and impactful, kind of develops or trickles out because of that. Is that something you've saw too? Because to me, it seems like there's always something to be learned from this decision.
I think so, and I think when you study Dred Scott, and I don't profess to be an expert like some people before me are. I don't want to come here and say that I am, but when you look into it more and more, it takes in more different things, more different talking points, for lack of a better word.
Mm-hmm.
The people that were involved. I think the meaning never really goes away, and I think it goes greater with time. And again, it's very negative meaning. Trust me.
Yeah, absolutely. And just in your work that you currently do, is the Dred. How do we? What is there a way that Americans reflect on the Dred Scott case every year? Because I know in certain historical impactful situations, such as a decision like this, there's always some type of ceremony or event. But we don't really have that for this decision, and I do believe it is important to remember and reflect on.
You have the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation, which is run by descendants of Dred Scott. They've tried to preserve not only his memory, but the meaning of the case in American history. Dred Scott, to many Americans, is 2 words they knew in a high school history textbook,
Right.
which is really unfortunate. Even his life in the Quad Cities. He's forgotten most places. If you've ever visited Dred's grave in Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis, he's buried at Calvary Cemetery, which has an inordinate amount of famous people there, William Sherman and others. It's a very nondescript tombstone for someone a very unassuming man who played a pivotal role in our American history. But that's what it is. People know the name Dred Scott and the words, and that's unfortunately all that most people know about it.
That is really unfortunate, and hopefully, that we can. Somebody eventually does something more to reflect on that. I would never have thought that he would be in an almost unrecognizable or kind of just normal, headstone. I thought that would be something that would almost be, a monument in a way.
Scott was a very unassuming man. After he finally received his freedom because his ownership was passed back to one of the original families that owned him. They manumitted him, they emancipated him. He was only alive for about 18 months.
Wow.
After the infamous Supreme Court decision. He worked as a porter in St. Louis. His wife took in laundry. He died of tuberculosis on September 17th, 1858, which was just slightly more than 18 months after the Supreme Court decision.
Wow. I did not know that. That is actually very fascinating. And wow. I mean, talk about, that's awful. And Tom, now many consider this the worst decision ever rendered by the Supreme Court and eventually overturned by the 13th and 14th Amendments, correct?
Yes, sir, for the 14th in particular.
And now, do you, in your opinion, with all the write-ups and all the research that you've done, not just, with this, because you were very honest about it, but just in research that you've done collectively, is this the worst Supreme Court decision ever rendered, in your opinion?
Well, I'm certainly not a skilled legal term, but I think so, and other justices who served on the Supreme Court think so. And Abraham Lincoln was very appalled by it. I think it's very easy to make the case it was the worst decision the Supreme Court ever made.
And now with this, initially, and this is something I definitely wanted to hit on, and I don't know if you have any information about this, but when this decision comes out, we didn't get news. News I always think is so, interesting because we don't, we get our news right off the, presses, about a second after it's told. It seems like it's already on, social media or in our inboxes. How long did it take for the public, if you do know, to find out about this decision? Was it rather quickly, or did it take some months to trickle out throughout the nation?
It took some time, as news did at the time, because it was all by newspaper and telegraph and that type of thing. The Northern abolitionists were inflamed by it pretty early on. We, like as you correctly point out, we didn't live in a news per second world back then, but people got a hold of it, and the people that were paying attention learned relatively quickly and were incensed about it from the start.
Wow, that's very insightful. And Tom, is there any other tidbits that you'd like to fill us in about on this Dred Scott decision? Because this is really great that you're able to give us your time and come on and talk about this. Because I'm honest about what I don't know, Tom, but I am always fascinated to learn more about impactful decisions and historical events like this.
Well, Abraham Lincoln, I mentioned him. He spoke out against it in a speech in Springfield on June 26, 1857, just about 3.5 months later. Abolition was not a popular stance even through much of the North. But Lincoln, as he was wont to do, he had spoken out against slavery in fiery, fervent fashion in Bloomington on May 29, 1856, being the lost speech of the first Republican State Convention. In his speech in Springfield in June of 1857, which is his only major speech of 1857, he pretty much said that blacks had the same rights under the Declaration of Independence. That was not a popular stance with everyone, and took considerable courage to come out and say that. And I think that's something that people don't give Lincoln enough credit for today. The risks that he took to stand up against slavery, not only beforehand, but certainly as president. He was a politician. He wanted to see how abolitionists would go, how things would be. There is no doubt of that.
That is.
But at the same time,
sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine. No, fine. I'll say quickly that that statement that he made against Dred Scott, again, took quite a bit of political courage and backbone.
And you know, I mean, so many things that you just said, just kind of, you know, I don't know what just happened, Tom, but all of a sudden light bulbs just started firing off like I'm a department store, like, you know, Kmart, we have the blue light going on. But with this, I mean, what I'm thinking about now, Tom, is just exactly what you just said. For somebody who is making such a, you know, a point that is completely against the grain, and to be able to really say this, is there a way that you can kind of correlate this, you know, with what Lincoln did with Dred Scott and making that speech and saying we are all equal, you know, and that we're all equal? Is there a correlation to now that you see in any way to that, to the Dred Scott decision and where we are in 2023?
I think some Americans, I say some because there weren't as many as there should have been, in 1857 wanted to see blacks having the same rights under the Declaration of Independence. It's something we still struggle with today, and many people feel that blacks have not received those same. You know, I'm not here as a social commentator. I'm simply saying some people said that. But I think the crux of the Dred Scott case and the resulting backlash, I think, are still things that we struggle with today in our society. And it's so ironic that such an unassuming man as Dred Scott, who fought so hard for his freedom through 11 years of court cases, and is forgotten today by so many. I think what he did, we're still struggling with today.
That's a great point, Tom. I mean, that is such a great point. And is there anything else you would like to add on this Dred Scott reflection before I let you go? Because I really appreciate your insights. It's really cool to hear someone say, this isn't a social commentary. Here's just what I know. It's very refreshing.
Well, I think people need to learn more about the fights we've had in our American history. What blacks have done, what whites have done to help some blacks, such as the stances that Lincoln took and the people that supported Dred Scott. I think it's been such a struggle in so many ways in our history, and we have much to be proud of, but much we've struggled with. And I think we need to understand some things that came for us, and like you said, I was glad you brought that up, to try to apply it to how we're dealing with things today, and what can we do better? What can we learn from? Most importantly, what can we learn from it?
Yep. Absolutely. And Tom, I really appreciate your insights. I love reading your write-ups in the Buzz magazine. You were busy on March. You had a lot of write-ups in the magazine, man, and they were all awesome.
Yeah, Tara Cale, the publisher, took quite a few of my articles. Most of those articles were older. The Dred Scott article I wrote originally did for the Molding Dispatch in 2014.
Oh.
Yeah, and so that was kind of a recycled article. Most of my articles in the Buzz I've written before, but the Dred Scott one was one and I'll say this: I've had many people like you be very complimentary. I've also had some of the most negative feedback to the article of anyone I've ever done because of the racial climate, and I think that's disgusting, frankly.
Yes.
But I appreciate your comments on that, and it's an article I'm very proud of.
Well, and you know, it's something that I think that we always need to reflect on each year, because, like you said, you know, this is an individual, I believe, as well, that needs to be recognized more than what he is.
And I know some people are, and I think more should.
Absolutely. Tom Emery, thank you so much for your time at 9:45 on the 16th day of March. We'll take a quick break and come back with more of our daily show after this.